Welcome to Oratio. This is Brave Common Sermon Cast series of Scripture as an Act of Resistance. We are on episode 16, and it has been a minute since I've been on here preaching, but I'm happy to do so this week, especially in light of a lot of events. And I think that this sermon on Mark chapter 10 has a lot to do with things going on culturally about our trans family, and also some other pieces about marginalized communities, queer folk, and people of color. So this episode is going to be titled "The Last Shall Be the First," and it really is truly a segue, I apologize, Michael's speech that he did at the Reformation Project acted as a direct segue into this sermon, and rightly so, because it's the portion of Mark leading up to where we're at now. So let's go ahead and just get right into the text, and we will deconstruct it. So this is Mark chapter 10, verses 46 through 52. The caption on my NRSV is "The Healing of Blind Bartimaeus." So let's go ahead and just read that. They came to Jericho, and as he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And the blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." And Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." And immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. This is pretty incredible, because this person who receives this healing decides to use this new position that he has to be able to see, to follow Jesus, which is really cool. So this story, this is something I learned in my biblical studies degree, and I'm happy to share it with you now. This is actually a literary method used by the author, and there's something deeper happening here with this story about blind Bartimaeus. You may not remember, but earlier in Mark, in chapter 8 specifically, there was a story about another blind man, a man at Bethsaida. And that is in Mark chapter 8, verses 22. I'm going to go ahead and read that. The caption for this is "Jesus cures a blind man at Bethsaida." They came to Bethsaida. Some people brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had put saliva on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Can you see anything?" And the man looked up and said, "I can see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Then he sent him away to his home, saying, "Don't even go into the village." So this is the inclusio. That is where the inclusio begins. And the way we can envision what an inclusio is, it's kind of like a sandwich. Or another way to explain it is like bookends. If you can imagine a shelf of books, and there's two bookends on both sides, and in between are the books on the shelf, or the hamburger meat in between the buns of the sandwich. And the purpose of this literary method, which is used actually a lot throughout the entire Bible, including in the Hebrew Bible. There are even small sections of verses called inclusios. The point of the inclusio is to add a level of like a story within a story. So we have this narrative, right, in the Gospel of Mark, but there's a deeper thing happening here that a lot of people may or may not see, and hopefully we can go through that now. But the first story of the blind man in chapter 8 is, according to many, many scholars, is a symbolic reference to the disciples and other people's inability to understand Jesus' true identity. So Jesus, from a scholarly perspective, also receives a lot of criticism, like, in chapter 8, that he doesn't have the full ability to heal someone. It takes him a couple of times before the first blind man is healed. But if you notice the difference between the two stories, the blind Bartimaeus in chapter 10 was desperately crying out for Jesus to heal him and to have him see again. And he believed, the Bartimaeus believed that Jesus could do this. In contrast to the men at Bethsaida, who his friends actually bring him to Jesus. And, there's a sort of faith thing here that's kind of not clicking in the same ways that it is with blind Bartimaeus in chapter 10. So the symbolic reference has directly to do with the disciples' own understanding of Jesus and them kind of getting the story, but not really understanding his true identity, and sort of getting it, but actually acting in opposition to Jesus in many ways. And that is where the inclusio, the meat of the story, kind of occurs, is in the center. In between Mark chapter 8 and Mark chapter 10, we see a lot of activity on the disciples' parts where they don't get it. As a matter of fact, in Mark chapter 9, it states, "But they did not understand what he was saying, and they were afraid to ask him." So Jesus makes all these claims about how he's going to die and be resurrected, and the disciples just are like, "What? You can't die. You're the Messiah. This doesn't work." So there are three things that basically Jesus' followers have in mind, and especially his disciples, about Jesus' own identity. But Jesus kind of thwarts the conventional notions that all of these people have about who the Messiah is and what the Messiah is going to look like. So Jesus, the expectation is that Jesus is a Davidic Mashiach. So he is the Messiah predicted to come in the Hebrew Bible, especially from Isaiah and Psalms. He's also the Son of Man. That's a term used frequently about the Messiah. And he is the Son of God. So there's these three sort of ideas about Jesus that the disciples have. And this also has political implications. There is an expectation that Jesus would have the power to overthrow Roman imperial government, or that would be a desire on his part, being the Son of God and being the Mashiach. But what Jesus is trying to get the disciples and these other folks who come across his path to understand is that he is not just the Davidic Mashiach. He is not just the Son of Man, and he is not just the Son of God. He is all three of these things at one time. And the expectations that the disciples may have, or that other people may have, aren't exactly in alignment with what Jesus' expectations are and what Jesus is looking for on the part of his followers. So I think we've seen this sort of build up of people approaching Jesus, like the rich young ruler, and even people of lowly status, to for lack of a better term, people who aren't expected to have the special ability to receive these gifts from God, but they do. People like children, people who are poor, people who are by all cultural and socio standards, they're defective. And I'm sorry for using this ableist language, but this is actually the language within the book of Mark. And Mark is using, unfortunately, the struggles that someone has with seeing to apply that to a human's inability to understand. So seeing here, or the inability to see on the part of these blind men, has to do with the lack of understanding, the lack of seeing up here and understanding. So countless times throughout the book of Mark, Jesus' identity is misunderstood. by not just the disciples, but by other people. So the rich young ruler, for instance, he thought as long as he was obedient and followed all of Torah law and was continually being blessed by that with riches, that he was on the right track. But Jesus points out to him that it's not about the rewards that you receive for being obedient. It's about a sacrifice that you make. Like, will you still have your faith intact even if you don't receive these blessings? It's a heart condition. And what's more is that people in a lower status, or someone who is experiencing poverty, or someone who is outcast or marginalized, has an easier time understanding and receiving the gifts from Jesus. And they have an easier time following him than someone who is in a position of status, in a position of privilege. And that's really the sort of turnaround here, or the reveal that Jesus is trying to say, that it's not about your status or stature. It's not about political power. It's not about any of that. It's about a heart condition that he's looking for. So the disciples can only see part of the picture, but it's the other people in the narrative, the people who are of low status, who get all of the picture pretty much right away. But Jesus takes the time out with the disciples, and he's very patient with these folks who aren't understanding and trying to help them be able to see. And of course, he is challenging traditional views, and Jesus is pretty hard on the people of status and the people who have access to, like, the biblical text, for example, or the Hebrew Bible, the people who are in the position of authority, who have the ability to teach the scripture and to teach the text. He says about the Pharisees in Mark chapter 7, verses 6 through 8, that these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far away from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. And you abandon the commandment of God to hold to a human tradition. And the commandment of God, of course, is ultimately to love God and to love others. And what does that look like? Well, that's why this sermon is entitled "The Last Shall Be the First." Because by conventional standards, we would think that a person of privilege, or a person who is not a person of color, or a person who is heteronormative or white, male, would have an easier time accessing the gifts of God, or having faith in Jesus and not being barred or rejected from doing so. The irony is that we are barred from doing those things as people of color, as LGBTQ plus persons, as people in a marginalized community, even as women. The irony is that Jesus is saying that it's those of us who are marginalized who have an easier way of accessing Jesus than these other folks who are in positions of privilege, authority, and status do, because they don't see. Like the blind man, they are unable to get the cloudiness out of the way and fully perceive the true identity of Jesus, and fully perceive in their hearts what it takes in order to receive these gifts. That is the reversal that we see happening in Mark, especially up through the story of blind Bartimaeus in chapter 10, the subject of today's sermon. Because blind Bartimaeus knows that Jesus is going to do this. He knows what his request is. He knows what he wants to ask for, and he has full faith in Jesus that he can do this. And what's more is that once he is healed and he's able to see, he gets up and he follows Jesus. So the proof is in the actions of this man. He had so much faith that Jesus was able to liberate him from this, from his inability to see physically, biologically, whatever was happening to him, that he was willing to back it up with action at the end. So it's interesting too that Jesus is not revealing his own identity in certain ways. Throughout the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is kind of famous for wanting to keep things on the down low and letting people know, don't say anything, or you know this about me, but be quiet about it. So there's a sort of intimate relationship between Jesus and the people he's healing and the people he's dealing with directly, to sort of keep that information between them until the right time comes, when Jesus actually does proclaim that he is all those things, the Davidic Mashiach, the Son of Man, and the Son of God, come in the flesh. And that happens at the end of Mark, when basically he's interrogated by Pontius Pilate, who asks him, "Are you these things?" And Jesus says, "I am." Which, the "I am" statement, I've said before, is a direct correlation to God's identification to Moses, when Moses asks God, or Elohim, "What is your name?" or "Who can I tell the Egyptians who you are? How should I identify you? What are your pronouns?" And God replies as Yahweh, which means "I am." Jesus does the same thing here in Mark, and it's even heavier. The focus on the "I am" statements is heavier in the Gospel of John. So, this is a pretty incredible little bit of the story where Jesus does, in fact, take full claim of all of these identifying markers, even though there may be some confusion surrounding his identity. So Jesus rewards the lowest people by conventional cultural and socioeconomic understanding and standards. He's rewarding them above and beyond people who are in statuses of privilege, recognition, teaching, authority, all those things. So the purpose and focus of Jesus is to pay full attention to those who aren't normally paid any attention to at all, the ones who are discarded, the deplorables, the disenfranchised. That is the great reversal. So when Jesus, in the verses that Michael spoke about, when James and John, who are disciples, demand of Jesus to have a seat of power and recognition with Christ in his glory, Jesus is like, you don't get it. Jesus says, whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Again, the point of Jesus, his whole work, is to set aside his own authority, his own power, his own status, to serve people of all kinds. And he even touches those who are physically sick. And by Torah law would forbid Jesus to even do that, to put his hands on people who are bleeding, to put his hands on people who are quote unquote unclean. But he does this. He breaks the law because he loves. Because love usurps all of the traditions, or the human traditions or human ideologies about whatever the Torah says. That is sort of the ultimate standard. So it is true that the last really are the first, and the first shall be the last. So the reversal is really important here, that we understand that. So when we see in culture and in politics and in media now, people, who are deplorable by culture, so for instance, the transgender community, or our trans siblings, who are undergoing a assault right now by the Trump administration. I don't think the Bible could be any more clear about the trans person's status before God. And those folks in the Trump administration, and anyone who supports that ought to be very careful when they claim to have a tie with Christianity, because the text I just read clearly shows that Jesus favors those who are marginalized and outcast by society. And what Jesus is looking for is what's happening in here, what's happening in the heart, not what's happening on the exterior. It's explicitly stated in the Bible, I don't have the verse now, but that it's humans who look at and pay attention to someone's exterior, but God intentionally is looking at the heart. God does not care about the outside, about the shell, about the tent that we wear in our bodies, but he cares about your heart condition. And he cares about the turmoil and the trauma that people undergo when they're just attacked for knowing that their body needs to change. Jesus is condemning the ones, or putting to task the people who have privilege, status, and authority to uplift those who are on the margins, including trans siblings. This is kind of a cliche story, but I want to end with this because I think it's something we all should do. But my call to all of us today is to look at our trans family and hold them in a seat of honor, to uplift them and to encourage them, and to look at a story within something that happens all around us every day that we don't pay attention to, but it's the story of the metamorphosis that a butterfly undergoes. So this is something that just happens in nature, and it's really beautiful. But a caterpillar, when it's in its chrysalis form, and it's sort of becoming a part of the cocoon, the caterpillar actually dies. And from that substance that's created within that death of the caterpillar, that substance allows the butterfly to grow. So there is a complete transformation that occurs, and the old shell and the parts that made up the caterpillar, or what would become the butterfly, die, and they disintegrate. And that disintegration is actually what causes the butterfly to evolve into what it is, and to give birth to itself out of the cocoon. And I feel like there's a beautiful reflection within that story, within nature, that we can look at when we try to understand, or just even attempt to try to understand, what it's like for our trans family who undergoes this kind of process to become who they are, to become who they really are and who they really are meant to be. There's a certain level of respect and love and admiration that we need to have for that process, because they are steps ahead of a lot of us. Because the fact of the matter is that no matter how you identify as trans or cisgender or heterosexual or whatever, okay, there is no resurrection in ourselves if we don't die first. If something doesn't die inside of us, there's no way we can be resurrected in Christ. I feel like the people who are the most marginalized, the most disenfranchised, they undergo this death time and time again, and this resurrection time and time again. So if you want to find where Jesus is at work today, look no further than the trans community. Look no further than the LGBTQ plus community, or queer folk, or people of color. This is happening on the regular. If you're wondering why no one is going to church anymore, no one wants to go to church anymore, or the Trump administration and the political or Christian ties to that are very ineffective and coming off as hateful and abusive and harmful. It's because Jesus is not in that. Jesus is nowhere near you if you are involved in that. But Jesus is clearly involved in the lives of our trans family, our trans community, our LGBTQ community, people of color, in the lives of those who are marginalized and disenfranchised on a daily basis. Jesus is in those stories, and that's where Jesus is active. If you want to be in the activity of Jesus, you need to be with us. Jesus' activity was clearly directed at those who needed it most, at the ones who were the deplorables and the rejected. So if you wanted to find where Jesus was at, pretty good bet and guess that it was with people who were poor, with people who were Gentiles, with people who were not accepted by culture or society or by, stature or status or anything like that. Jesus was focused intently on those who had no attention or no spotlight put on them. So I think that's the biggest takeaway from this, is that those who are in opposition to LGBTQ folks, to our trans family, have no credibility and no argument up against the very words of Jesus and up against the actions of Jesus recorded in the Gospels and recorded in the New Testament. You have no argument. You have no basis, no claim. Quoting from Genesis 1 about male and female and all that good stuff, it just isn't working here. These are people who refuse to die like to themselves. These are people who refuse to see, even though Jesus has his hands on their eyes, like trying to help them get it, but they don't get it. We have to have, unfortunately for us, it's very difficult, and I know I personally wrestle with this, is how do we forgive these folks, and how do we still walk with them, or do we need to walk away? There's all different kinds of things we can do, but it really is a tensive moment to navigate through, and we have to do the best we can to protect our hearts, protect our own health, and our safety, obviously. But I want this to be an encouraging word to the transgender community, that you are blessed and beloved by God, and you have seats of honor at the table before God. And I pray and call you to come and take your seat at the table, because you deserve to sit there in a seat of honor and glory with Christ. I make the same call to my LGBTQ siblings. If you've been pushed or banned out or barred out by the church, that is not what Jesus is telling us in the text. And that is not the action of what Jesus displays to us through the text. So your blessing is waiting for you, and your reward is waiting for you. You just have to tell God, like with blind Bartimaeus, Jesus says, what do you want me to do for you? And he says, Teacher, I want to be able to see. And Jesus says, okay, your faith has healed you. Is it that easy? I think it's something worth trying to see if it's that easy. That's how amazing Jesus is. I hope this stands as a word of encouragement to you for the rest of the week. I encourage all of our listeners, please register to vote and make your voices heard through voting. I think that now more than ever, the time is desperate, and we all need to enact our rights and duties as citizens in this country, or in the United States. And stay tuned for Azusa Pacific University updates. We have some big things happening in the media with NBC and possibly NPR, and some public documents rolling out that we're going to need some support with. So we'll keep you updated through Brave Commons on Facebook, our website, also on Instagram and Twitter. And thank you for joining us today. Have a wonderful week, guys.